So I've been working here for 3 years with my PhD in Israel, and I also be sometimes in Minneapolis with another PI. And I've been working with phages, vesicles, and yeah, basically biology and synthetic biology.
To do what?
To try to make a lighting cycle. So basically like reproduce when a bacteria explodes to produce more phages, and to try to reproduce that on a synthetic cell, totally in vitro.
And you're an ex-IGEMer.
And I'm an ex-IGEMer, and where I was with Jake, to see again. And yeah, I really like the Cree and looking for this big project. And also, sorry, and Marc, who was putting chips on us. And you remember you were.
So one of your mice is here.
I'm so sorry. I hope you
Where did you put chips? What does that mean?
Oh well, that's enough. That could be a whole story on that. But like the first year on the IGEM project, we tried to use something they developed at MIT, which is sensors that you put around your neck, and they have RFID sensors, so they are able to measure distance. It was before the whole kind of contract tracing COVID thing happened. Yeah, so they were.
But it was kind of in that intention also? Or?
It was actually intentional.
Huh.
Yeah, it was intentional. I worked with Bill Gates. The idea was to put microchips in the vaccines. But
Like, people wonder why it itches you.
so, hello everyone. So, today I'm going to try to talk just a bit about the team and then leave the floor to Shakra to present some things that I think can be relevant, especially to some new direction of the LPI. So there's people involved in the team here. I'm gonna showcase a bit their project. So for the new people in the room, I wanted to kind of recover a bit what we're doing. We're interested in using networks to understand things like large-scale collaboration and especially open collaboration. This is an example of people working on files on Linux, and you see all these people moving around and doing modification on the code. And over 30 years, there's been 17,000 people that volunteered to help and do that code that is now on 3 billion devices around the world. So we're interested in understanding how that happened, how you can have this scaling, and how the people are able to work together. And so, well, we have a page. So basically, we use network science to really understand this community science, how this community is organized, scale, solve, but also learn together and innovate. And the part on innovation will be a bit later. I just wanted to show actually one typical example of actually what we do. So this is an example we did on ourselves. So this is from digital traces of our Slack. We recreated the network of our interactions. So just to understand how we actually operate, right? And so that's an example where you look at that and you're like, well, actually that kind of corresponds to some things we know. Like the colors are communities in the network, so they represent groups of people that interact more together than with the rest. And they indeed correspond to sub-teams that work on specific projects. But it's also kind of, there is some centralization because it's a scientific team, so there is a PI. And there is also kind of an onion structure because you have collaborators, external collaborators that are invited over some projects. And the kind of thing we do is that we take these digital traces, and so that's an example on us, but then you can look, for example, temporally how that evolves. So you can take a network and you can look at things like clustering, which is if my friends are also connected together. So when you're in a team, everyone is kind of connected together. I mean, the clustering is pretty high and you expect that. But then you can look at things like density. So how many interactions you have. And for example, if you, like here in time, you see that density increases, so you have more and more cross interaction, but at some point it begins to decrease while modularity increases, which is like how much you begin to make little subgroups. And so that's an example where you can begin to feel, for example, is the network becoming distributed, decentralized, or is it still a star network and centralized? So you can begin to ask questions and also quantify something. So it's the same data, it's this team network, like our team network, but then you can look at things, for example, such as degree distribution, which is how many connections people have, and you can rank people by how many connections they have. And what we see, something we also see in other studies, is that it tends to be an exponential distribution in those cases. And as time went on, this distribution converged to this one distribution here. And you can compute the exponent of that distribution, and that's typically similar to doing a Gini coefficient. It's an inequality measure. It tells...
Go ahead. You don't see when you're pointing on the screen, sir.
Ah, yes, how do I... Yes, I can point with my finger.
If you're...
Yeah, I can point...
Or maybe if we.
Yes. Yes, because the camera has been shown.
Either we zoom out or you point with the mouse.
Okay, sorry, yes. Okay, I will then, I don't know how to zoom out. So, contrôler la caméra, maybe?
Yeah.
But we don't see the camera anymore.
Yeah, I can't see anyway. So I will point with my, what I was meaning is that this red distribution, right? So you can compute, like, for example, exponent of that distribution, and that tells you, it tells you something about the concentration in the network, like the concentration in only a subset of the number of people, for example, like the amount of interactions. And again, that's interesting because we know in our team that indeed we began 1, 2, and then you recruit people, and we know that this number 5, 6 indeed corresponds to some structural element of the team, which is the amount of people that are actually hired and paid by the team, which is the core team, and the rest is kind of collaborators, etc. So all that to show that we can use digital traces like mentioned in public channels on the Slack, which would seem to be really not a lot of things, but to actually tell a lot of stories on a social group, right? So that's kind of what we do, and we do that on many different projects that I grouped here into collecting data that is like digital traces and reconstructing group behavior from that, experimental projects that are more into actually collecting data, or organizing research program to analyze data from that, and qualitative, which are more related to surveying and like in general qualitative methods. All right, so I will, let me see. Yes, very good, I put a timer. I will just show a bit some big areas we're tackling, and I will show the people involved in that in the team. And it might kind of reflect to some of the projects you are doing, and so that will allow you to link to those people in the team. So some type of projects are related to more temporal data on network, and we're looking typically on networks that are either activity projects, so activity networks of projects where you link activities in a large-scale project by which activity comes first and to the next. And then you can look at things like delay propagation, so that allows us to inform of the fragility of a large-scale network and where you want to avoid having delay so that they propagate. So that's a paper we did last year, which was on many large-scale engineering projects. And we use also the same kind of methods of trying to understand propagation of some quantities on a network, doing that on a collaborative network in learning experiments. And that's something we do with Sasha Poke here that we began 2 years ago, and with Rathin. And these are networks where we have some interaction between people. Here is a phone call network, and we also have some information on their individual performance on some tasks. And then we can do measures of, for example, if you interact with someone who performed well already, do you also perform well afterwards? And we look at these cascades of performance in these networks. So these are all temporal description of peer influence on network and on performance. Other types of data we have are related to more network structure of teams and group performance, so not individual performance, but group performance. For that, we look first what we did 2 years ago, again with Sasha and with Luba, who's going to talk about some things later, is that we showed how to deal with digital traces in a way that you can reconstruct social network in a way that is as much as possible representing indeed social interaction. So that's a paper we did 2 years ago. And then we're using this kind of modeling and this kind of, say, reconstruction in order to do that on real data sets. And one of the main data sets we've studied, and you've been part of that, right, is the iGEM data set. The reason is that because we have 3,000 teams for which we have a lot of digital traces. So we have digital traces related to what they write in their lab notebook, which other teams they collaborate with, and also what are biological elements they produce, what are the performance of the team at the end of the day. And here's the kind of methods we do for that is to look at reconstructing team structures from the digital data, and from these team structures, trying to infer what are features that can predict team performance. And so we do a model in that case, it's ordinal logit model to predict performance. But we also not just predict performance, but try and look at the evolution of that performance over participation and trying to look at the team learning over time. And so that's something that maybe at next presentation I can dive more into, because this year with Ratin and with Robbie Ward that are on this slide, we are collecting data from teams and to look more deeper at the social network of teams. I won't dive into that today. So these are about small teams, and we're also working with Raphael in the team on larger teams, which are actually open teams. These are open source projects. And we're looking at GitHub data, which is a big repository of open source projects, into things related to core periphery structures. So here you have example of 3 projects where in time you have data of contribution. So each line is a person, and we look at the variety of projects. For example, projects where everyone contributes significantly, some of them where only a few people are core contributors versus those that are leader-based and all other people are just very, very small involvement in the contribution. And then we try to project that into network of interaction between people using the files that they commit on, so using the kind of objects they're related through, and looking at how the organization modularizes as this project scale, and how then you can look at interaction within those modules and between those modules, and at the role of the core contributors into the stability in time of these networks. And so that's something we're doing with Raphael. And that's more generally, all these things are what we proposed and cover in the ANR that is going to take the next 2 years about modeling these interactions and trying to understand this open collaboration, in particular using socio-ecological and mutualistic network modeling. All right. So finally, we also make tools. So this is more like data-driven study. We also make tools. So we published one last year that we made, which is a tool to collect an app to collect data on social network of teams, in particular collecting which tasks the team are working on and doing that in time so that you can transcribe into temporal network of collaboration. And we're also doing tools for visualizing then these networks. So this is an example of a very, very large network. In that case, it's a Twitter study where with Leo, who is now a fellow here, short-term fellow, we did a platform to visualize the temporal data that allows to look at a big network database and try and understand what are the links, and selecting those. And actually, he made it in 3D. And the challenge was to make it fast enough as well so that it can run on a web browser. And so that's kind of more on the tool side. And finally, we're so these were data-driven visualization, and we're doing implementation. So actually going, running some program and then looking at this program and trying to understand what happened. So this is something we've done particularly with the nonprofit Just One Giant Lab that runs several large-scale programs from a few hundred people to a few thousand. We had a paper already published on one done 3 years ago, the Co-Immune program, and more recently the Open COVID program that had a few thousand participants. And it's the same, we use digital traces from Slack and from the platform to understand who collaborates with whom, what skills are interacted together. And especially, and also I think that's relevant for LPI, we try to understand what creates engagement for people because they have thousands of other people to interact with. And so we look at things such as the impact of recommending them objects in the platform. And that's something that we worked together with Bastien also on the Nesta grant. And for example, on these kind of platforms, we look at how people react to seeing needs from other projects. And we look at what makes them click on those needs rather than other needs. So what do they try to help? And then we can look that they try to help things for which they have shared skills, or for projects that are more active or more popular than others. And from that, we try to understand a bit better how we could foster and accelerate these programs.
How do you define different popularity and activity?
So activity here is
people are in project and activity is how many clicks or
activity is the number of posts that the project has done. So it's how much basically it documents what it's doing. Popularity is how many saves the project has had from people. And a save is not a public thing you can see. It's not like. It's something you bookmark because you like it. And it's an invisible feature. So it's not preferential attachment. So it's more a signature. It's popularity in the sense that people tend to think this project has value to some extent. Right? But it's a hidden characteristic from the site.
so it's sort of inherent value or something.
It's
intrinsic.
As much intrinsic as possible.
Intrinsic.
Yeah.
Maybe, the wording can be, because there the signal is the highest, so you want to find the right word that really captures it.
Actually, that's a good point. Yeah. You would say what then? Intrinsic quality or
Quality,
interest.
Interest, intrinsic motivation, or sort of intra-group.
Interest is a good one, actually.
But no, the fact that it captures something sort of not of an individual but of the collective in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah, so collective interest. Yeah. That's a good
Anyways.
one.
But then it becomes a bit circular, that's the problem. You're measuring the future interest by past interest.
Yeah, but at least it's not a preferential attachment. It's not because you see it, so it's still non-linear, as you say. I mean, it's not necessarily non-linear, but it's, yeah, we would need to see how it scales with number of cities, for example. And the last thing before ShackRush presents is something we're working on to almost publish. So the preprint is almost, the paper is almost finished. A post-analysis of also how you can basically not just study yourself to engage people and do recommender systems, etc., but let people themselves review projects that can be interesting in the community. And from these reviews, decide on what project can get, for example, resources, such as micro grants of a few thousand euros. And so we run 6 of these episodes of micro grants and project selection that were run by the community. So the people in the community would themselves review other projects. And because we ask them a lot of questions in the review, we can look at things such as how when you review, you correlate with other reviewers so that you know, are you somehow biased in your reviewing, or are you kind of able to review in the same manner, and we find correlation between reviewers that are relatively the same than what you have in ERC, for example. But then we can look at things such as when people reapply, do these projects improve? And so are you able through the review system to also do these things that in a hackathon is very hard, which is to keep over years the projects going on and not just finishing at the end of the first little challenge. And so we looked also at how these kind of rounds of review allow projects to reapply and to actually implement with very little money, continue implementing actually the projects over time.
The black line is the mean of the others, or?
So black line is the mean of all projects. So this is projects that have submitted to the one review, then submitted to 2 review, to 3 review, 4 review. And what we see is the beginning. So basically, if you standardize projects as a Z-score, like the score that they have, so you begin at 0. And then on average, what you see is that the project improve and improve. But what we see is actually what happened is a selection process where the project that's submitted initially and were actually good, they will continue resubmitting. So what you're doing is not improving over time, is selecting over time the one that initially had potential.
That's my interpretation.
So it's not, so there's, I think we have example of at least, we had 2 projects that submitted the first time and were refused and resubmitted and then were passing the threshold to get accepted. We have 2 projects like that. And otherwise the rest is selection process where the ones that were good initially are continue to be motivated, which is something we're usually seeing even with prod for SDGs, that you have these gear cycles and you're trying to find a way that the ones that were good to make them continue their thing. So it's kind of in that sense, it's working to allow continued implementation of early phase projects. And for some cases, it's working for.
But at least it motivates the good people, right?
Exactly. It's a motivational.
Yeah, but also it's hard to actually make inferences based on like this, as there's like a strong selection just based on how early people got on board, right? Like, there's only projects which applied in the very first round that can get a participation count of 5.
Okay, that's true.
So like if you joined in round 3, there were only 3 other rounds or 2 other rounds you could.
Yeah, I have the raw data where we see when they actually, which rounds they started. And so definitely not all of them are from first round. So you have definitely.
Yeah, but they cannot make it ever to
But
put
they cannot.
on the x-axis.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
One thing that is missing is all the dropouts.
So yeah, in a
I
way.
think they're trying to find a way in which, if you want to show this as a sieve, right?
Yeah.
Here it seems that, the old pass, but basically it's a filtering run.
Yeah, I mean, you see that through the points. So the points are the one that only did the first, but so they're all distributed around this normal distribution.
Yeah, but
And then you would.
I could put as you move, right?
I understand.
Because
How should represent that?
I don't know, but basically the way that you see
I know.
here is that you afterwards you make the average or the mean only of the ones that repeat. Right?
Exactly. So it's a tree. It's kind of like a fitness. I don't know exactly how to represent. That's why I'm sure in biology you have a way.
Well, in biology you would look at the selection factor. Okay, so you look at, you have a strong selection in the first cycle, right, and less because you stay with good ones.
And that selection factor is you have a formula, like it would be.
Basically, you can look at ratio of individuals that succeed, right, in passing, right. So if you when you do bacteria, right, you say, okay, 1%, were selected for resistance or in some condition, something like that.
Like a fitness.
Or you look at growth rates, right? So you look at ratio of growth rates, right? And you say, okay, there are those that lose, right? They do not get selected to the next round.
So like the percentile of selection, and shows that in time you basically decrease it so that okay. That's a good idea. Okay.
But then that's also slightly misleading as you make like the cutoff not the same in every round, right? You like dynamically decided how many, like what is the cutoff score people need to take to be a successful round application?
I think it was always 3.5. I have to see which.
But that's sort of the same when you do a biological experiment, right? When you sort of select, new selection for antibiotics, right? You start with a certain concentration of antibiotics, and then the next round you increase the selection barrier, and then you can still do this in a dynamic way. It's just that, in a biological experiment, you have an objective target, right? Whereas here it's a bit less defined. But anyway, trying to, because if the point is to say that, the peer review is not much, I would say this way, okay? If you can separate 2 effects of peer review, one is increasing the level, increasing quality, and the other of filtering, and how these 2 work in tandem. Maybe you need sort of 2 graphs to show which one, and you have to find a way to that in each graph you sort of isolate one effect from the other.
Yeah, because it's the same question. I would need to discuss more with you because it's the same problem we have with reparticipating IGM team because it's exactly the same thing. You have dropouts and we don't measure it well, I think, but we're trying to do models of selection right now. So maybe I would love to discuss a bit more technically with that with you. Very good. And I will actually leave the floor to Shakresh. And I hope Jean-Marc is around. Jean-Marc, are you around?
Yeah, he joined.
Okay, because this is for you. Okay. I think it can be interest for you because this whole thing started with trying to understand if we can do we learn, and measure how people learn in time, it would be amazing. But the data is not yet there. And so, and so the question was like, can we use scientific data to understand how people innovate in time? What are the trajectories in time? And that's something Shakresh has been working on and had a paper recently. So you can go ahead.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thanks, Marc, for the introduction. So most of you know already what we work on. So basically, it's so I work personally in the context of the science of science, and I'm trying to understand how scientific fields evolve. And part of that project is to also see how can we understand better the knowledge trajectories in the scientific space. So to quickly give you a brief overview of what we are doing, So this over here is like there is no definite way in which you can imagine the knowledge space as a perceivable space around you, which is the 2 or 3 dimensions. So there are a lot of things that we need to keep in mind when we are trying to embed something which is a very high dimensional thing onto something that is perceivable by the human mind. So that this schematic is kind of representing you the challenges that we face in doing those things. So what I will talk you through is how we are trying to overcome these challenges and basically what exactly those challenges are and how are we trying to solve the questions that arise. And to know more about that, I would invite you to discuss with us, especially with Vibha. So yeah, giving you a very brief overview of the whole summary. So the main question that we are trying to address is the mechanisms that underlie the knowledge discovery process. And in order to do that, we look into methods to quantify the rise and fall of scientific fields. How that can explain the exploration and exploitation of research ideas, and how can we associate all of that to the researchers' trajectories in the knowledge space. So for that, we use the open source archive dataset. So it's a pretty long dataset in terms of years, it's 30 years long. And what it has is a very well-defined system of annotation, like they have a very good system of assigning field tags to research articles. So that takes away a lot of problem in terms of associating topics to papers. It has around 1.5 million articles, and wherever it was possible, we were able to link the unique identifiers for authors as well to the papers. We couldn't do that for all of them. The average number of authors is around 250,000, but we only could retrieve around 50,000 ORCID IDs. But we'll come to that later on. So this is the metadata that we extract from the archive papers. So we use the archive API for this case. So what we extract is the timestamp of submission, the contributing authors, and also the field tags. And we do that for all the field tags for the entire year, entire 30 years. And what we get is on the right is the heat map, which is kind of representing the entire evolution of the archive dataset. And each row is the proportion of article a field has in the whole share in that year. And then the rows are arranged chronologically in the appearance of the highest peak time for all the fields. So what you can see is that in the beginning of the dataset, most of the papers were coming from fields from physics and maths. But over the years, you see upcoming interdisciplinary fields such as computer science, natural language processing, data structures, and all that. taking over the space and becoming more and more dominant, which kind of indicates a shift in the research interests and also the increasing community of researchers. Well, so that is the overall data set that we have. Now, what we do is we do two things. The first thing is to construct the core tag network. So the core,
Do you normalize the number of papers by field because?
yeah. So we normalize by the total number of papers in that year. So basically, what you see is the proportion each field has in that given year.
Okay.
And then when I do the row, I renormalize by the maximum value.
Okay.
So then I know that which field had its peak time.
Okay.
But so yeah, so these are normalized.
Okay.
And so the first thing that we do is we collect all the field tags, and for every two field tags, we connect them if they have papers that mention both of them. And then we define a threshold measure. We can discuss how we do that in detail later on, but given that threshold measure, we construct the core tag network. And what we get is a network like this, where you can specifically see the dominant research areas in archive. So the purple is mostly fields from physics. The green one is maths, yellowish is computer science, and in between you can also see some interdisciplinary fields such as quantitative finance and quantitative bio. What we also do additionally is we define a distance measure called cognitive distance over here, which is kind of a proxy to compare the similarity between two fields. And what it does is that it takes any two field tags. It looks at the weighted shortest path between the two field tags, and the distance is the sum over the reciprocals of the weights. And if there are more than one shortest paths, we take the one which has the minimum of the distance. So remember this definition, because I will come to this again in some slides, but this is the measure for cognitive distance. And the second thing that we do is because now we have a time series of so many fields, we look at the best possible way in which we can describe the evolution. And for that, so we compared a lot of distributions. Out of those, the two parameter Gumbel distribution seems to be fitting all the fields really well. So the alpha is the location parameter, and beta.
Just on the last slide, I guess you can make a more complex definition in which you normalize for sort of available edges. So if there's a field that is less represented, you are likely to have less items. So the sigma is by default going to be lower, right? If you are in a.
Yeah, but I think the way we threshold it kind of controls for that. So what?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Go for it. Yeah.
So should I?
You can just explain, but you can.
Yeah. So the thing that we do is the thresholding is done using the hypergeometric p-value. So what we just don't look at is the total number of papers, but the chance of randomly sampling the common papers, controlling for the size of both the fields.
You look at it, it's the same number based. Okay.
Yeah.
So I mean I have the size, but I can.
That's a good question. Actually, yeah, because weighted network you want this kind of.
So yeah, and then so we actually fit the two parameter Gumbel distribution to the fields, and what we can do with this is now, once we have the location and scale parameters for all the fields, we can actually rescale the timeline of fields and collapse all of them onto a single rise and fall curve, and that also kind of that also fits well with the Gumbel distribution.
I love this graph.
And now
I love this graph every time I see it.
now the good.
If you don't see the log version of it, which is.
But what is your natural kind of attempt? What would you fit with that?
I go.
Because it depends from where you come from. Like people are like, why don't you choose?
So we actually did those like all of the distributions that were very intuitive, but this is coming out strongly. But okay,
This
so
one is coming out strongly because you by the mathematician. You're the Google.
No, but it's like something which is from string value statistic distributions. It's one of the most known.
Yes.
Capture this. But maybe you have some other intuition which you can actually share from your experience. That's, yeah.
So yeah, and then because we can do the rescaling, we borrow so we borrow from the diffusion of innovation literature the ways to mark the stages of evolution. And so when we look at the literature, we can actually divide the evolution into 5 different stages. I forgot to put the labels, but so it goes from the creation stage, the adoption, the peak, early decay, and late decay. And now that we have different stages, we can actually compare different metrics related to each of those stages and compare them across. And what we do is we look at the average team size in each phase, and we observe that in the earlier phases, there are relatively smaller team sizes, whereas in the late phases, you have bigger teams working on projects. When we look at the number of field tags used per paper in the earlier phases, they appear to be higher in the beginning phases, whereas in the late phases they are lower field tags. But it is not much different from the random behavior. So that is where we use the cognitive distance measure that we defined earlier. And when so this is the number of distinct field tags being used. But now when we look at the cognitive distance that we had on the weighted network between those field tags, we can see that in the earlier phases, not only do people use distinct tags, but they also use them from very different distant fields. So that kind of strengthens our hypothesis that in the early phases, people are really trying to explore the fields, whereas in the late phases, they are more exploiting the same work that has been done.
So I have a question on that. The field tags are not static, right? They evolve over time. So
Yes.
they take new ones, and maybe like after a couple of years, archive just adds a new field tag for this new discipline, quote unquote. So you somehow correct.
So what we did is that, and I would say that we were lucky because post 1993, they were not. So all the field tags that we had in our network were there from 1993. So we basically didn't have to worry too much about new field tags appearing. But what we did is that we actually, in this case, did a cumulative network. So we don't really look at the temporal changes between the field tags string, but we had all the field tags. So we didn't add new, there were no changes in the number of field tags over the year that we looked into. But if they change, we will have to control for that. So
That didn't merge, and actually there is a very interesting algorithm for that. People discuss in archive. It's like they agree on accepting new tag. Yeah.
So, and then, so because also to add, when we were looking at the fields, we had to, so yeah, so there was a selection process to look at the fields that kind of are only unimodal. So most of the times the very new tags were not included in the calculations that we did. So they were the measures that I show you were only from the fields that were consistent throughout the data set.
So this introduced like a big bias towards making things look like there's like a. So did you just ignore the field tags or all the articles which included field tags which were not present?
No, so what we did was we first look at all the fields and then we simply remove the ones that were non-unimodal and were present for at least 10 years, so that we have a timeline to study. And that actually reduced a lot of fields from the study. But what remained were around 75 fields that we then look into, and all the measures that you see are averaged over fields. So we kind of try to control for the dominance of like the physics field tags. But yes, so that is something that we still need to explore how to control the temporality. But I think I will talk about it a little when I get to the next part. So, but the main conclusion from the first study that we did is that scientific fields, they exhibit a universal rise and fall pattern, which allows us to define standardized stages of evolution. Early stages are more about smaller teams doing interdisciplinary research, whereas later stages are larger teams building upon the existing work. And the network-based measure was able to strongly indicate the innovative. It was a marker of innovation in terms of the distant field tags being connected. So we did a lot of other measures as well. So for that, I would invite you guys to check our preprint. So the paper is still under review, but feel free to come.
One thing that I remember from the results, just to make sure that it's well in my mind, is that longevity, the scientific longevity of researchers that were involved in the early stage, in an early stage, was higher
Yes.
than the average.
Yes.
Okay, that's maintained.
Yeah, we show a few results here so that we are in time, but yes, we have the.
But that's the message I give you, talk about your work, so just to make sure that.
Okay, but now coming to the question that we raised earlier, like how can we associate all of that by?
So you say that you observe a rise and fall, but
Yeah.
you really observe a fall or maybe more stabilization because when you show the graph with the Google Fit, it seems that it did not fit very well the extremes, the extreme distribution, and you have more like some.
Yes, so with that, the thing is, I would say that we do observe a rise and a fall, but the rate at which the fall happens is very different for different fields. So because in the data set that we have, when we do the rescaling, so most of the data set is accumulated on the adaptation to early decay. So because of that, the metrics that we have are very strong for the early stages. And for the late decay, we still have a lot of variance.
It's really actually interesting, but again, I take things from my biology perspective, right? And when you look at reactions, like enzymatic reactions, right? So, binding reactions.
Yeah.
So you have, it's defined by the K-on, right? The binding, and the K-off when they separate, right?
Yeah.
And in many cases, right, sort of when you evolve things well, right, the K-on is diffusion limited, and therefore it's much more homogeneous. But how good things are stuck, right, are defined by what is the chance for them to fall off. So if I think now as a field, right, if you have a good idea, right, the exploration phase is maybe limited by diffusion of knowledge. Could they say, okay, or the chance of someone to engage and go on board, right? But then, right, the K-off, so the loss of the relative loss of interest in the field, so you go and work on something else, right, will be different in different fields. So overall, and I think that looking, if what I'm saying is correct, right, you can, rather than doing an accumulative one, you can sort of calculate the K-on and the K-off separately for different fields and show that it's much narrower on the K-on side.
This is something, this is what we wanted to do with SIR kind of fitting, because this process of kind of forgetting is related with kind of people are almost.
SIR is like the susceptible infected recovered model. It's kind of like it's kind of K-on, K-off. It's like you're susceptible. So like infected would be that it's K-on, and recovered is K-off, right? Recovered from the field.
So the initial interest and engagement of people sort of is sort of limited by how much time you have in order to start a new field. But then your K-off, right, can depend because of different things of funding or your affinity, relative affinity to the subject, whether you find yourself to make an impact there or not. So I think it's sort of showing that there is big variance on one side and much lower in the other actually is a good point to make.
It's a very good idea.
Some fields like climate, for example, they were very influenced by this right COP, and you could see this, but they were kind of exceptions. But it's really can see that.
It's different here, it's mixture models, because so a lot of this also going back up is because we see multimodality oftentimes where, for example, indeed like COP, for example, so climate, you have peaks regularly because you have a conference and people are
Wait,
reattracted.
technology was
What we think of these are mixture models of more well-defined curves that reproduce exogenous shocks or endogenous shocks. And that just in time would kind of like have another coming, right? And ideally, you would want to implement a mixture model, and probably that would actually, we should see if the mixture model will solve the extra part.
But you can separate sort of height research compared to vast research this way, right? And so
Yeah.
Like QFIN, if you go back to QFIN, actually, QFIN is a nice one because QFIN, well, it's not the exact year, but the absolute year is 2007. And so what you have with quantitative finance is like there's a crisis and boom. It's not a fad, it's more like COVID, exactly what happened with the research on COVID. It's like there's a need, so they need to understand it. And so what you have is a pure exogenous shock, a pure effect of like a need. And that's versus the endogenous shock, which is the evolution more of like, maybe mathematics is completely endogenous, nobody needs it. So it's completely about actual interest driven. I mean, maybe not the blindness, but.
But have you looked at more to model this at temporal dynamics, like auto-exciting processes where you have this exogenous shocks, maybe either an event from the environment or a seminal paper, and then some kind of clustering after that, like people reacting to that, and then it's kind of, goes down, and then another because you have temporal dynamics modeling. And maybe you could have this also stationarity at the end.
We could definitely discuss that more, definitely.
and more politicians, more mathematicians.
Yes! All these women doing math.
So then, with all that information, the other aspect is to see if all of that can be associated with the researchers' trajectories. But before that, we need a way to look at those trajectories. And so what we do is, so then the question is to see if we can understand how researchers actually navigate the knowledge space and what are the features of those trajectories. Then what are the determining factors for the way that we notice the trajectories to be, and then how does it vary with different stages of the fields. But before that, we actually need a way to embed the knowledge space onto 2 and 3 dimensions, and that is really challenging, and we are still this is an ongoing work, so the thing that makes it harder is because there are a lot of ways in which you can do the input the information. So you can have papers as your nodes in the case, or you can have fields as your points, and then you can have relationship between nodes, between fields of paper as the citations that are exchanged between them, or the common keywords that are exchanged between them, or a combination of all of those things. And then there are different number of embeddings that people use these days. Some are graph-based embeddings. So because when we deal with such data sets, they usually are very large scale. So small scale embeddings, they work well in some cases, but are not necessarily scalable to large data sets. So then we have to use graph embedding methods. So some of the embedding methods that we use were node-to-vec, force atlas 2. And then you also have the recent development of distance-based embeddings, where you have some sorts of loss functions that are optimized to get the optimal lower dimension distance between higher dimensional data points. And the famous one that people use are TISNI and UMAP. And then there is one very good method called Spectre, which kind of uses information of all the possible ways of connecting the papers, and then has a nice way to define loss function, which kind of which gives you a good distance metric, but it is not very scalable. So this is also but we try all of these. So the first way that we look into is looking at the common key tags that papers have. So now what you see over here is each point is a unique combination of key tag that has been used in arXiv. So when you look at the 1.5 million data papers, there were around 45,000 unique combinations that people have used. So why the combination matters is because, in this case, it doesn't, the way in which the tags are arranged doesn't really matter. But what matters is the combination that you chose in your paper. So for example, if you're connecting high energy with the data science and machine learning, that is different from connecting high energy with condensed matter and quantum physics. So that's how these locations differ. And when we just look at the vectors of key tags used and do the Tisney mapping, this is what we get. And over here, the color coding is based on the first tag that was used in that combination. So now this is one way to have the knowledge space in 2 dimensions. And then what you can do is, because we had those 50,000 authors mapped to their articles, we can actually look at their trajectory in this space as which combinations they visited in time, and then and the number of times they visited those combinations. So that can basically be viewed as the origin point, and the center of mass being like how much weightage you gave to each of the locations. So you can then have a notion of mass and density and the center of mass. So that lets us do the maths for trajectory-based calculations. And the first thing that you could look into is the mean squared displacement from your origin. So usually the dashed line that you see is when you have a linear displacement, and if things are less than, so over here, if the alpha is less than 1, then that means you are subdiffusive. So that kind of indicates like how you are diffusing into the knowledge space. So we did this measure for our case. I forgot to put the value of alpha, but I only take people who had at least 10 jumps. So I don't look into authors who were maybe publishing 1 or 2 articles and then going disappearing, but at least 10 jumps. The next thing that you look into is how those jumps happen. So basically now you are moving in the space, so you can take some small jumps and then again make a long jump, and that is something that usually not happens at random. Like you would have a reason to take a long jump, and it could be any reason, and that can happen at different scales. So you can be somebody who is always taking relatively larger jumps and then take a very, very long jump, or you can be a person who is within a region making small jumps, then take a relatively longer jump and then again exploring the space. So to compare all such trajectories on the same scale, we look at the consecutive jump distances on the embedded space and then do the z-score distribution. And what we see is a bimodality in the z-score distribution, which means that there are both local and long jumps in the data set. And when we compare that with the random, over here the random is just shuffling the trajectories of all the authors and looking at the distribution again. So that is very, very unimodal. So that kind of tells us that something is happening over here, which we need to look into more.
When you say jump, this is a temporal event in the history of a particular researcher? So they started in one area and then there was an event in time when they moved into a different area, or is it the overall shape of their publication cluster? So
this is temporal for sure. Like because you are looking at the publication dates of all the articles, and then each consecutive jump means that whenever you put up a new article, so that would mean that it is temporal, and also
you explore locally and then you go to the
okay. So this is not someone who spent their entire career publishing simultaneously in 2 different domains. You have to start and then move.
Typically, if you have that, you would have these 2 blobs with a lot of lines in between, because you would go back and forth between 2. So we don't see simultaneity. We see everything as steps. And like you do bio, then you do MOOC, then you come back to bio, and you stay there for some time, and maybe you redo MOOC later. And so what we would see is like that you have this blob on the left, and then you have 2 times you've done this back and forth somewhere else, but you didn't stay there.
I see.
Yeah, but
do you know the Creative Leap story?
Yes, you shared with us.
I shared it with you long time ago, right?
Like
With
opinion, or
Sorry?
it was an opinion.
No, there was
No,
a
it
beautiful.
was, it was
So they were with all
Yeah, it was very-
And so they cite, there's a famous writer called Arthur Kester, that might be Kester, and that wrote beautiful books also for kids, etc., etc. And he came with this idea of, in his book of creative leaps, which exactly predicts this. It's a 1964 book or 1960 book, right?
Introduction.
So read that. So in the creative leap work, what they did is they gave people the possibility on a grid over 10 by 10 to make a drawing.
Yeah, this was.
And they can move the digits, right? And then whenever they think that they've created something new, right, they click save, right? And then so you have sort of all the solution space is known, right? And you look at how people basically screen, right?
Well, okay.
Because this was kind of foraging behavior when you forget where your keys are, right? When you search for them in the room, you also go somewhere and you search, okay, they're not here, and it's universal in the way search behavior. It's the most optimal in the way. Well,
So you manage to make it letter A, right? You look around,
yeah,
A, and then you say, okay, that's an A. Now I can try to make a B or a C or et cetera, right? And every time you jump again until you perfect the letter, and then you go again to another one, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there are many where you make a house and then you try to make a tree or.
Yeah, it's almost a gradient descent somehow also.
Anyways, I think that it's good to read this.
Yeah,
But that's beautiful that you find these jumps.
And so, yeah, so to verify even more, like what the nature of these jumps are, we so do a measure that was very well reported in human mobility patterns. It's a good paper by Papalado and Baravasi. They do returners versus explorers dichotomy, and so we did the same measure on the research trajectories and kind of find very similar patterns in when we look at the radius of gyration, and that kind of gives us a confirmation that okay, what we are noticing is not maybe it is something that can explain the nature of how people are exploring the research space. But then when we make a jump, people can argue that it could be a completely random behavior, but not necessarily. So I recently came from Porto and I traveled like so far, and that was because I went there to present something. But I live in Paris, so I always navigate around in Paris. So the hypothesis is that whenever you are making a very, very long jump, it could be, it is for a reason. And in the case of research space, we want to know exactly what those reasons might be. So to do that, because we have a lot of data points, and what we notice is that when we do a simple 2D density map, we find regions of high density, but we still don't have a very good definition to define boundaries for like specific locations. So to simplify our calculations, we convert the whole space into grid. And then for every grid, we calculate the localized density, which is the center of mass in this case. Centroid in this case, and then we can measure for every grid the number of times people visited in delta t intervals and the average citations accumulated by all the papers in that grid. And when we do that, we can actually then look at the flow as we have in the human mobility. So what I show over here is the top outflux places in the mobility map, and the darker the color, the more number of people went from this point to the outside location. So now what it does is that this lets us use the already existing rich literature of the mobility analysis to see if we can find something similar or something completely different. And when we do that, we use a very simple notion to begin with, the gravity model. So it may be not the best model, but it is still a very good way to just see what the effects are. And when we independently looked at the flow between locations versus the distance between the locations, it had an inverse relationship. And then, so the MIMJ over here could be any number of quantities. It could be the citations in the last delta T years or the number of visits in the last delta T years. So we did, so this is still ongoing, but we are, so this is one of the preliminary results that we have. So we are looking at the gravity model, but considering only the visits that happened in both the locations in last 5 years. And when we fit the model and predict the flow rate versus the true values, it kind of seems to have a good fitting, but this is definitely improved. Like we need to improve this. So, and also bring in a lot of other metrics, for example, the citations and visits. But this gives us the confidence that we can do mobility-based analysis on these things and maybe predict a good way to understand and interpret the jumps. However, as I said, that there are so many different ways to do the embedding. So just to be sure that our results are robust, we are also looking into other ways in which we can embed the data set. So over here, I show you 2 examples. So the left one is looking at the citations between the archive papers and then using the UMAP embedding. And what we get is like a cluster of papers, very close clusters, and the colors are so the blue are mostly maths fields, the green is computer science, and the purple is all the tags from physics. I could more recolor them, but over here I didn't do that. And on the right, what you see is the connection between papers having common keywords. And since this data set was strictly from the APS publications, which is physics-based publications, what you see over here are fields that are only in physics. So this one is astrophysics, high energy, condensed matter, and this is applied physics mostly, and all the other branches. So this was just to show that there are different ways to embed the data set. And what we did is we then do a kind of a sanity check. So just to see if we do get the similar behavior as we observed in the Disney embedding. And for both the cases, we do the same consecutive distance distribution, and it kind of has a similar bimodal behavior. So that gives us that tells us that okay, what we are thinking is not completely wrong. And now we have to build up more on this and do maybe more checks and more robustness measures. The one challenging thing that we are still thinking when we are working with, so we have Michele Stanini, who recently joined us in our team for this project. And with him, all of us are trying to understand how can we, so basically as Bastian also said, that there could be new tags created every year. So basically when in research, you are not exploring a space, you are actually creating the space as you move on. You could discover a completely new field, you have a new tag, and then you notice that people start to move into that space. So basically, your movement is creating the space and also changing the space with time. So you need to detangle both those effects. So you need to detangle the change in space versus the change in temporal effect. So that is something that we are still working on. At the moment, what we do is we simply fix certain time intervals and assume things to be fixed and do our measures, but we would definitely want to incorporate the shift in these 2 things. And like just to check, over here we did a cumulative check on the bimodality of the trajectories, and so the bimodality is definitely something that is very robust, so that is a good thing. But yeah, so this is the one part of the study we are starting to write up about it, but this thing with the temporal is something that we still have to work on. And on that context, any ideas or inputs would be very, very helpful. So yeah, so that's it. Thanks.
One of the questions that we asked before was whether there are sort of low-hanging fruits in terms of other databases that you can apply directly your code, right, and see its reproducibility.
So what we have is so we are working with another PhD student, Fabrice, So we have this finger dataset with us, but the main problem that we are having is the annotation of fields to papers. So for example, in archive, they have a mechanism which we can say that the paper is having these field tags. In other databases, they usually either just give the keywords which are given by the authors so that there's no control, or they do some sort of topic modeling to associate papers. So we first need to converge on a way in which we define papers with topics, and then we can just run the codes that we have to look at how those topics are being used over time and check on that. So that is also one other part of our study, which is scaling all this up to very large data sets.
The other possibility is looking at the distance metrics by WeLearn.
Yes, actually, so
They can
we have
give
an in-house thing.
Right, yeah, we have it in-house.
Okay. So it takes the abstract, with the abstract, for example? Yeah, actually, that's exactly.
Yeah, actually, Jean-Marc asked something.
Yeah.
Can we do that, Jean-Marc? Can we use your code?
Somehow, yes. I'd like to make 3 comments. First one is that it's a very interesting research that you're doing here. Your framework is really interesting. So I think we should have a chat very soon. And I'd like also to have a work session with you because there are probably a lot of that we can share.
Yeah.
However, I'm concerned with the way you work. You work with dimension reductions, because basically TSNE and UMAP, those are nonlinear dimension reduction algorithms, and they are when you do that, you keep the local proximity, but you lose strictly the distance notion.
Yeah.
It means that the way you separate the local jumps and the long distance jumps is interesting, but it's not completely accurate, because though some long distance jumps may be actually artifacts from the dimension reduction algorithm.
Yeah, but that's why we try to find the optimal dimension and control for the effect of MSD, which seems to be stable when I test it across different dimensions. So we find the optimal dimension, then we come up, which is of the size of n square root of n, and then we go and test whether it gives the same result for different dimensions. So we don't account for that, but actually we didn't find any papers. Maybe some biologists, at least I think you know a lot about embeddings. You know whether actually there are any measures where you would find where, at which dimension you start to get artifacts.
So
you are talking about
one way that we are discussing to kind of ensure that the results that we have are robust is to just sample random points from the embeddings, and if not exact, but if the far distances in the true space are correlating with the far distances in the embedded space, then we can at least say that, okay, if they are not the exact mapping of the far distances, but if still it's correlated, then I can say that what we have is not the artifact, but something that we can consider as a signal. So that is one way I thought we could, at least make it more robust. But yes,
you also did the bimodality in the original space, if I remember.
So we did but the bimodality. So we also measured the bimodality in the true space, like which is 175 dimensions, and we had bimodality even then. So having the bimodality in distribution is kind of our robustness check for now. But yes, I definitely agree that TSNE and UMAP are very, very nonlinear. So we need to have some sort of control to tell people that we are checking for that as well.
Yeah, and the reason we apply them is not for applying them, because everyone does embeddings in a way, but because indeed it's much easier to work with them, and then afterwards it reduces some redundancy in data, because it is very multidimensional. right? But it's very
And
sparse.
by the way, we really don't have an idea of what the dimensionality is of science, basically, like of the knowledge space. So for that also people are working out to have the optimal dimensionality of the space. So it's hard, but yes, let's see if we would be very, very happy to discuss for sure.
I also saw in your slides that you considered using Spectre.
Yeah.
And Spectre is, as far as I remember, is the way to. It's an embedding model specifically trained on research papers.
Exactly.
So, have you already tried it?
So we tried that, but what they don't say in the paper is that it is definitely not easily scalable. So because they have like really, really high GPUs to implement their model, and in the paper they only do like 100,000 papers and they share the embeddings. But in our case, it is 1.5 million articles, which is still a shorter data set. We have like data sets in Springer. I think we have even more, like I think around 50 million articles. So I don't know how scalable that would be, but definitely like Fabrice with us is working on that as well. So we'll see. But I think the scalability is the key challenge in the case of Spectre.
Actually, we are in the following months. We're supposed in the Willon project. We're supposed to handle the S2ORC database, which is tens of millions of articles. So we have to tackle the scalability issue. That's another reason that we have to chat.
Yeah.
Let's chat. Let's chat.
Bastian had a question.
Yeah, no, for the long jumps, I was just wondering if that's also potentially an artifact of like the new field tags appearing. Because if they appear new at the time, like it looks like a jump is there, not yet connected to anything.
And that's
So this would be one way to also sanity check whether the temporal evolution, if you just look at like to which parts are the jumps, like what makes them a long jump. And
so
because like the quantitative bio, I think was like what 2003.
Yeah.
So that's like over 10 years after arXiv started. There's like a whole new universe of space that people can explore.
Yeah.
I assume there's more of this as well.
So when we did the temporal thing, we fixed like for a different delta t's, and we did the.
You have done the embedding with just physics. I think that's the answer. You have the IPS command embedded, right? And it's still by model because there's no new field in there.
Yeah. And for example, in this case also, like up to 2000, and then so and this is just I'm showing over here up to 2000, but we did for from 1993, like did 3 years and then again 3 years and then again 3 years.
There's an effect, an intrinsic effect, and what you're talking about extrinsic.
Exactly.
And I think it's important to know the weight.
And it may be an effect of sort of fractality of space in a way that you have this physics and you have sub-physics and you have sub-physics in mathematics. It's true, right? That you have like very focused. Okay, I do exactly this automorphisms. So maybe this and that.
But that part that you are saying, we are actually working on that measure to see if how much can we differentiate between the two, but that is a little hard. So, and especially when you have the walks, it's very hard to model the behavior. So, but yeah, hopefully we will do it. Yeah, any more questions?
Thank you.
How do I?
Right, what's next? What's the next seminar?